You are lying in bed at 2 in the morning, thumbs sliding across a bright screen, telling yourself that tomorrow you will finally call someone about the way your head has felt lately. You could reach a doctor, a counselor, or a friend who actually picks up. That option belongs to you only because you were born in this century. Move the clock backward, and it quietly disappears. For roughly 300,000 years, no appointment existed anywhere on Earth. There was no clinic, no diagnosis, no gentle term for the weight sitting behind your eyes. Anatomically modern humans have lived on this planet for about that long, and across almost all of it, a mind that started to unravel carried no label that meant sickness. So picture the problem from inside that world. Someone in your small band stops sleeping, starts speaking to people nobody else can see, and turns violent by the fire. What do you do with them when your language has no word for what is wrong? The trail begins with a hole cut into a human skull. Archaeologists have recovered thousands of ancient skulls with deliberate openings carved into the bone while the owner was still alive. The earliest cluster runs back more than 7,000 years, and the practice appears on every inhabited continent, from the fields of France to the highlands of Peru. Someone took a sharpened flint, set it against a living scalp, and scraped until the bone opened. How did ancient humans treat a mind that stopped making sense? And why did so many of these patients live through it? Every answer ahead lands stranger than the one before it, and the final one may feel closer to your own life than you expect. Step into a settlement 8,000 years ago and watch how trouble gets explained. A hunter comes back from the hills changed, muttering, flinching at shapes in the dark. Nobody around him reaches for biology, because biology as you understand it will not be invented for thousands of years. They reach for the unseen. To them, the obvious cause is that something entered him, a ghost, an angry ancestor, a spirit crossing over from the world that presses against this one. When your model of the body holds no brain chemistry at all, possession works as a diagnosis, and the word carries none of the mockery that superstition carries for you now. That logic reached paper the moment writing existed. In ancient Mesopotamia, a Babylonian scholar named Esagil-kin-Apli assembled one of the earliest known medical works around 1050 BC, a set of clay tablets that modern researchers call the Diagnostic Handbook. It lists symptoms with real care. A patient whose face keeps twitching, whose neck turns on its own, who cries out and remembers none of it afterward, gets recorded under a chilling phrase, the hand of a ghost. Depression, seizures, and what we might now call psychosis all appear on those tablets, sorted and named, each one traced to a spirit or a god with a grievance. The Babylonians watch the same behaviors a modern psychiatrist watches every week. They simply read a different author behind them. Ask yourself what you would actually do with a belief like that. If a spirit has climbed inside a skull, the sensible cure is to get it back out, and Mesopotamia had a specialist for exactly that job. He was called the Ashipu, a healer priest who read illness as the work of demons and ghosts. His toolkit ran to incantations, amulets, and the naming of the thing tormenting his patient. When a mother lost child after child, the blame fell on a demoness called Lamashtu, and families hung a small bronze charm of the monstrous spirit Pazuzu around the neck to frighten her away. Picture the scene. A frightened person rocking in the dark while a priest chants over him and presses metal into his hand. Useless by our standards, and yet somebody sat with that sufferer through the night and told him the chaos in his head had a name and a face. Hold on to that detail, because we will come back to what it was really doing. The Ashipu could chant. When chanting failed, some communities went further, and that returns us to the hole in the bone. The surgery has a name, trepanation, and it ranks among the oldest operations humanity ever attempted. In the 1860s, a French physician named Paul Broca examined a collection of prehistoric skulls sent to him from Peru, and he noticed something that unsettled his colleagues. The cut edges of many holes had grown smooth and rounded. Bone only remodels itself in a living body, so those smooth rims meant the patients had not died on the table. They had survived, sometimes for years, walking their villages with an opening in the top of their heads. Broca estimated that a large share of these patients lived through the procedure. a survival rate that quietly embarrassed several hospitals of his own century. Sit with how deliberate the whole thing was. At a Neolithic burial ground in Ensisheim, in what is now eastern France, a man from around 5000 BC turned up with 2 healed openings in his skull, one of them wider than a careful surgeon would attempt today without power tools. He was cut open, and he recovered, and then somebody cut him open a second time. Whatever pushed the community to do this, they clearly believed it worked often enough to repeat. The reason argued across generations of anthropologists is that they were opening a door for the spirit trapped inside. Let the intruder out, and the person buried under it might climb back to the surface. Would you lie still for a stranger with a flint blade, if the alternative was a lifetime with something screaming behind your eyes? Peru turned this into an art. The Paracas people, who lived along the coast well over 2,000 years ago, produced trepan skulls by the hundreds, cutting the bone with obsidian blades and small metal instruments, and possibly numbing the pain with coca leaves. Their techniques varied by region and by generation, from slow scraping to careful grooving to a clean rectangular incision, which tells you people were teaching the method and improving it. Here stands the first strange turn of the story. A practice that lethal and pointless would have burned out fast among people living on the edge of starvation. Its spread across thousands of years and thousands of miles suggests that, seen from the inside, it looked like medicine that delivered results. Not every band tried to drill the strangeness out of a person. In many, the individual who heard voices and saw the invisible was steered toward a role rather than a cure. Across Siberia, the Americas, and the far north, ethnographers documented a pattern with roots reaching deep into prehistory. The young person who broke down, wandered off, convulsed, and returned speaking of other worlds was often the very one marked to become a shaman, the figure who travels between the living and the spirits on behalf of everyone else. The historian of religion, Mircea Eliade, spent much of his career describing this path, the wounded healer, chosen precisely because his mind had crossed a border most people spend their lives avoiding. Turn that over for a moment. A young man in a Stone Age camp starts having visions and collapsing into trances. In your century, he might walk out of an office with a prescription. In his, he might walk into an apprenticeship. The same behavior that would isolate a person today could, in the right community, hand him status, purpose, and a permanent place at the center of the fire. This is one of the quiet shocks buried in the record, that a mind out of step with the group was sometimes read as a mind reaching past it and rewarded for the trip. Does that mean the ancient world was tender with the suffering? The next piece of evidence refuses to make it that simple. For a long time, scholars assumed early humans simply discarded anyone who could not pull their weight. The strongest counterexample sits in a cave in northern Iraq. At Shanidar, the archaeologist Ralph Solecki excavated the remains of Neanderthals who had lived tens of thousands of years ago, and one skeleton, known as Shanidar I, reshaped the whole argument. This individual had survived a crushing blow to the head that probably blinded one eye, along with a withered arm and leg injuries that would have left him barely able to feed himself. He lived for years in that broken state. He could only have managed it because others fed him, sheltered him, and moved him along when the band moved. Physical injury and mental illness are different conditions, and it would be dishonest to blur them together. What Shanidar proves is capacity. A community of Neanderthals over 40,000 years ago was willing and able to keep a dependent member alive long past the point where he could repay them. Once you know a group will do that for a broken body, the assumption that they would automatically abandon a broken mind starts to look thin. The care was already there in the toolkit. The only question was when a band chose to spend it, and on whom. Communities did not always choose gently, and pretending otherwise would flatten the truth. A person who turned dangerous, who lashed out at children or drew predators toward the camp with his shouting in the dark, put every single body around him at risk. Some were surely driven off into the cold. Some were surely killed by the people who had once fed them. The archaeological and written record holds the caregivers and the frightened side by side, often inside the same population, sometimes inside the same year. Move west and south, and the picture gains another layer along the Nile. ancient Egyptian healers left behind medical papyri, and the famous Ebers Papyrus, copied around 1550 BC, describes states that read a great deal like depression and dementia, conditions of a heart grown heavy and a mind that wanders and forgets. The Egyptians placed thought and feeling in the heart rather than the brain, so a suffering mind to them was a suffering heart. One older text, often called the dispute between a man and his Ba, dating back around 4,000 years, records a man arguing with his own soul about whether life is still worth carrying. Read it today, and the despair in it is instantly recognizable. A person that far back, with a completely different map of the body, still sat down and tried to put the darkness inside him into words, which is the same reflex that keeps you scrolling at 2 in the morning looking for something that names it. Then, on the edge of what we still call the ancient world, someone tried to pull the spirits out of the explanation entirely. Around 400 BC, the Greek physician Hippocrates and the circle around him produced a short text with a pointed title, On the Sacred Disease. The condition under discussion was almost certainly epilepsy, long treated as a direct touch from the gods. The opening argument was bold for its moment. This affliction, the author wrote, is no more sacred than any other, and its origin sits in the brain. He proposed that madness, melancholy, and seizures all rose out of the body itself, from imbalances among 4 fluids the Greeks called humors, with a surplus of black bile dragging a person down into a state they named melancholia. He was wrong about the fluids. Black bile does not exist the way he pictured it. The move he made underneath the mistake, though, is the one modern medicine still stands on, that a suffering mind has a physical cause you can study instead of a demon you must expel. The Greeks did not drop the older comforts overnight. Sick and desperate people still traveled to the temples of Asclepius, the healing god, at sites like Epidaurus, where they slept overnight in sacred halls in a ritual called incubation, hoping the god would visit their dreams and the priests would read a cure out of them the next morning. A troubled mind could get temple sleep and humoral theory in the same lifetime, from the same culture, without anybody feeling the contradiction. Centuries later, a physician named Archaeology of Cappadocia watched his patients closely enough to notice that people who sank into deep melancholy sometimes swung up into frenzied excitement, and he linked the 2 states as phases of one illness, an observation that would not be fully credited again for almost 2,000 years. Slowly, unevenly, healers were learning to look at the person on the ground instead of the sky above him. Far to the east, physicians in ancient India were sorting the same suffering into their own categories. The great Ayurvedic text known as the Charaka Samhita, whose roots stretch back centuries before it was fully written down, devotes long passages to a condition it calls unmada, a general word for insanity. Its authors split the causes in 2 directions at once. Some cases they traced to imbalances among the body's fundamental forces, the doshas, disturbed by grief, bad food, or exhaustion. Other cases they blamed on bhutas, invading spirits that seized a person from outside. What stands out is the range of treatments they prescribed. Alongside herbs, oils, and cleansing regimens, the text recommends steady reassurance, pleasant surroundings, familiar music, and the calming presence of trusted people. A doctor 2,000 years ago, working from a theory of invisible spirits, still arrived at the idea that a frightened mind heals faster when it feels safe and accompanied. That instinct keeps surfacing in culture after culture, no matter how wrong the underlying map of the body happens to be. Rome carried the argument into daylight and split loudly over it. The encyclopedist Aulus Cornelius Celsus, writing in the 1st century of our era, described treatments for the insane that swing between 2 poles. He listed occupation, reading, travel, and entertainment for the gentler cases, and in the same breath recorded darkness, restraint, and even hunger and beatings meant to shock a raving patient back into himself. Against that harshness stood Soranus of Ephesus, a physician of the same rough period, who argued for something a modern clinician would applaud. Soranus wanted his patients kept in rooms with even light and quiet, spoken to with patience, given meaningful tasks and conversation, and freed from the chains that others reached for by reflex. Two Roman doctors, working within a few generations of each other, looked at the identical problem and drew opposite conclusions about whether cruelty or kindness pulled a mind back. That fight over how to treat the suffering never actually ended. It simply changed its vocabulary and kept going, straight into the present. Why did the older story of gods and spirits take so long to fade? Part of the answer is that it kept proving useful to the people who held power. The historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, filled his pages with rulers losing their minds, and he rarely framed it as a medical event. He described the Persian king Cambyses II stabbing, mocking, and killing his way through a violent breakdown, and he read that collapse partly as punishment for the king's crimes against the gods and the dead. He told of the Spartan king Cleomenes, who fell into a state so severe that his own people locked him into wooden stocks, and who then took a blade from a guard and cut himself apart. To Herodotus and his audience, a king going mad carried a message. It announced that the man had offended something far larger than himself. Notice what that belief does to treatment. When a mind collapses and the entire culture reads it as a verdict from above, healing turns into a moral project as much as a physical one. You do not only try to calm the sufferer, you ask what he did to earn this, and what the gods might want in exchange for lifting it. For most of the human story, the mentally ill were understood through that double lens, as people in pain and as living signs to be interpreted. Their suffering meant something to everyone who stood around and watched it. Here the story bends hard against the picture most of us carry in our heads. We tend to assume the ancient world was uniformly brutal toward the mentally ill, all chains and exorcism and bodies left on hillsides. The evidence keeps refusing to sit still inside that frame. In a band of a few dozen people, there were no asylums to lock anyone inside, no institutions built to store the inconvenient out of everyone's sight. A person who struggled stayed inside the group, visible at every meal, folded into the daily work as far as he was able. Anthropologists studying small-scale societies in more recent times have found the same arrangement over and over, that individuals who would be diagnosed and separated in a modern city were instead absorbed, handed lighter tasks, watched over by kin, and kept firmly inside the circle. That absorption was not tenderness the way a hospital ward is tenderness. Much of it came from having nowhere else on earth to put a person. The result, for many sufferers, was still a life lived among familiar faces rather than behind a locked door. Loneliness of the modern shape. The specific isolation of a mind breaking down alone in a room was structurally difficult to arrange when your whole society could gather around a single fire. Strange as it lands, the person losing their grip in a Stone Age camp may have been less alone in their worst hour than the person going through the same thing tonight in a dark apartment with the phone face down. The ancients also had chemistry of a kind, long before anyone could explain it. Across Neolithic Europe, farmers were already growing the opium poppy, and archaeologists have pulled its seeds from settlements more than 7,000 years old, some of them clustered in ways that hint at deliberate use rather than food alone. Around the Mediterranean and the Near East, healers reached for henbane and mandrake, plants loaded with compounds that dull pain, force sleep, and quiet a thrashing body. A person raving through the night could be pressed to drink something bitter that finally let him rest, and the people around him would have seen the fury drain out of his face without any idea why. Their pharmacy was thin and dangerous, and the wrong dose killed. Even so, the impulse behind it points in a direction you would recognize. When words and rituals ran out, ancient humans looked for a substance that could reach into a suffering mind and turn the volume down. So what did treatment actually amount to in a world with no medicine that truly worked? Strip away the trepanation, the exorcism, the amulets, and the humors, and a stubborn core stays behind, and it comes down to presence, to the naming of the affliction, and to belonging inside a group that would not let a member vanish into the dark by himself. When a band gathered around a suffering person, sang over him, gave his affliction a name, and pressed the chaos into a shape they could all recognize together, they were doing something modern psychiatry has slowly circled back toward valuing. Their explanations were false, Yet the instinct underneath those explanations was sound. That is the uncomfortable inheritance sitting in the drilled skulls, and the demon lists, and the wounded healers. Ancient humans lacked every tool we would now call effective. They had no diagnosis that survives testing, no drug that genuinely helped, no theory of the brain worth keeping. And still, across all of it, one pattern holds up under the evidence. They kept their damaged people close, built meaning out of the breakdown, and treated a fracturing mind as a burden the whole group carried rather than one body's private failure. We ended up with the medicine they never had. The open question is whether we held on to the closeness they never lost. Which brings you back to your own 2 in the morning. You were lying in bed, thumb still resting on the bright screen, a promise to call someone still sitting unkept somewhere in your chest. You have options no Ashipu could offer and no Babylonian scribe could imagine. Real treatment, real names, real relief that actually arrives. What you may not have in that quiet and shadowed room is the fire and the ring of faces that once surrounded the